Agustín Reyna, welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. Always pleasure to see you.
Thank you very much, Ole. It's really a pleasure to be here.
We know how active BEUC is in so many digital affairs and beyond, trying to promote and protect and articulate better the interests of consumers in the European Union and probably beyond as well. So let me invite you, first of all, maybe to summarize the key areas which are currently in your priority list.
Yeah, sure. So for those that do not know BEUC very well, so we are the European Consumers Organization. So we are an umbrella organization representing national consumer groups and basically bringing the consumer voice in Europe. As such, we cover a wide range of policy areas and sectors and markets. So from financial services to transport and mobility, energy, product safety, obviously digital markets, so on and so forth. And in that context, we advocate for better consumer rights at the European level, but also engage actively on enforcement and implementation. And as you can imagine, digital markets have been an extremely important sector for consumers and consumer organizations in the last years. And that also was expressed in BEUC's involvement in very high-profile competition cases, so Google Shopping, Android, the Amazon cases, the Apple case, so on and so forth. As well as on the not only the adoption, but also the implementation of the new digital laws like the Digital Markets Act or the Digital Services Act.
And the impact of BEUC in all these cases and all this legislation is really impressive. It's really remarkable to see how nuanced your and proactive the interventions and propositions and comments and reflections are. My key question, obviously, there will be a series of questions related to primarily competition law and digital markets. So I wanted you maybe if you could highlight if you have a continuity, can you have a specific perception of consumer, how consumer interest can be protected? Because there is probably more than one or many different ways of promoting interest, giving priorities to some over the others. It's not kind of a zero-sum game. It's quite a sophisticated exercise, particularly if you have stakes in so many, maybe even occasionally mutually conflicting policies. How do you map this out?
Absolutely. One have to be extremely pragmatic and go to the source, which is the legislation, the case law and what it informs us in relation to how markets should develop, how certain practices should be addressed. Obviously, competition law per se and competition law enforcement is an extremely complex discipline. But for us as consumer organizations, what is really important is to highlight that whether it is through enforcement or through competition advocacy, the ultimate objective is to promote consumer welfare or consumer well-being. And I'm not saying consumer welfare in the US sense, but taking into account the broader interpretation of consumer welfare that we have in Europe that goes certainly beyond price effects, but really looks at choice, at quality, at innovation, and ultimately how consumers can better benefit from competitive markets and the importance of getting the right level of competition across the different sectors. And obviously, not all sectors are the same. Not all sectors present the same entry barriers, the same levels of competitiveness. And here is what is extremely important to always take an evidence-based approach. And when I say an evidence-based approach, this is not only to look at industrial organizational economics, but taking a broader perspective about the evidence that is needed in order to have a clear picture about certain practices or certain behavior and how this impacts ultimately consumers.
And one of the areas where you've been, I shouldn't say particular active because I don't follow all the areas where BEUC is active, but really visible is Digital Markets Act. So I wanted maybe to ask you to reflect upon the second round of compliance reports. How do you perceive them? And obviously on the latest first non-compliance fines and decisions more generally.
Yes, absolutely. So BEUC was involved in the adoption of the Digital Markets Act from the very beginning. Even before it was the Digital Markets Act, it was together with the idea to develop an instrument to address the challenges posed by digital platforms, that then it got detached, and we had on one side the Digital Markets Act and the other side the Digital Services Act. And we have followed the adoption very closely because of this experience that we have had with competition law enforcement, and we didn't want to made the same mistakes in the sense that these markets develop very quickly, so the practices, and therefore we needed to have an instrument in place that can target more directly those practices by certain companies, which ultimately affect not only the fairness of markets but also the contestability and ultimately competition in digital markets. So once we got the Digital Markets Act adopted, of course we needed to look at implementation, because it's great to have good laws in paper. It's even better when they deliver concrete changes in the markets. So we have been following very closely the implementation of the DMA. We have looked in particular at the different consumer-facing obligations of the DMA and how they have been complied with by the designated gatekeepers. And the first assessment that we made was not very positive, especially when it came from the different compliance reports, in which the gatekeepers that try to do some minimum changes without actually significantly changing the way they operate in a compliant manner with the different obligations. And this is because one needs to read the list of obligations that we have in the DMA together with the anti-circumvention clause. If from the consumer perspective, we look, for example, at the deployment of user interface design techniques such as dark patterns in order to avoid or bypass certain obligations, as well as to the general objectives of the DMA, which is to create more fair and more contestable markets. So we engaged with the European Commission as the sole and direct enforcer of the DMA. We provided comments and input. We even conducted behavioral testing in relation, for example, to the choice screen for search engines in the context of the implementation of the obligations by Google in this regard. And we have gathered significant insights about how consumers react to certain changes. And we put all that at the disposition of the European Commission so they could also inform their decisions on the compliance with the DMA. I must say that the Commission reacted very quickly. We cannot forget that the DMA has been in force for 1 year. And we have today the two first non-compliant decisions. So one can say that enforcement actually got much faster compared to competition law. And this is one of the biggest lessons that we had through the different competition cases that have been initiated and concluded in the last year. Of course, the story is not over, because probably these decisions might or might not be appealed before the court, but the Commission acted very diligently and rapidly in this regard. But of course, BEUC and my organization invested significant resources in order to put more evidence at the disposal of the European Commission. And now, for example, looking at the decisions that were adopted against Apple and Meta, so we welcome this decision for being good news in the sense of, okay, the Commission is doing something. It's not so good news that the companies are not compliant, because ultimately what we want is compliance and changes in the market, particularly in relation to Meta pay or consent model. We also understand that this is not compliant with the concrete provisions that we have in the DMA, something that we have been criticizing already for many years. And actually, BEUC articulated actually 3 complaints. One in relation to the DMA, although it's not a specific complaint under the DMA, but we made our observations known to the Commission as to the lack of compliance under consumer law. So we articulated what is called an external alert to the Consumer Protection Cooperation Network, and under the GDPR, because we consider that the consent is not freely given. So this also shows the interplay between these different areas of law that come together in relation to one concrete behavior. And now, of course, what is important for us is to see changes, in the markets and in the companies' behavior, so consumers ultimately can benefit for greater choices in digital markets.
And you mentioned anti-circumvention. The very rationale has been pioneered by BEUC during the DMA discussions. There is obviously technical circumvention, but there is also kind of normative or intellectual circumvention as well. We can hear this, and the rhetoric of consumers is very powerful toolkit, particularly if you have so many thousands and millions of consumers. They are not necessarily belonging to the same cluster. The interest of consumers can be different. So we can often see how gatekeepers, for the right reasons, probably try to prioritize and demonstrate how the restriction of the interest of some group of consumers can be beneficial to other groups of consumers, and how to measure the things. So how do you navigate in this labyrinth? Do you rely on evidence? But again, evidence is an interpretable concept. Do you have the kind of strategic understanding of what is right and what is wrong, or it's again it's rather on case by case basis, or something hybrid?
So consumers are heterogeneous. That's a reality. There is not a single image of a consumer. Even if we try to force a normative image of a consumer, the reality is that it's not. So it's extremely important to take a case-by-case approach. When it comes, for example, to user interface design, not all consumers react in the same way. But all consumers in a sample can show a very similar reaction to certain changes. So the typical example is if you have, for example, the typical cookies banner, and then you put accept in a given color and not accept in a different color, so on and so forth. That is a way to steer consumer choices. And these companies, they do it because they have been testing consumers. So we have all been part of A/B testing, even without knowing it. And for us, what is important is that, like the companies implement this testing, not only consumer organizations, but authorities should be able to do the same, should be able to understand what is behind a given design. And even if it's done for consumers with different backgrounds, ultimately they have one objective, which is to steer the consumer to make certain choices or not to make choices. And I think here is what is really important to take into account and not fall, so to say, in the trap that our consumers are different, so we cannot have a one-fit-all solution. Obviously, all consumers are different, but something that consumers do have in common is that no one likes to be taken advantage from. So I think that here I also need to think of the fact that consumers have different ways to making decisions, but what we need to ensure is that decisions are freely taken. And through user interface design, you can actually interfere in that decision-making process by testing how the majority of consumers will react to certain changes. And this is something that is not always visible to the enforcement authorities. And part of our role, I would say, is to make that visible to them, so they can see the importance of behavioral insights in the way also they conduct their investigation, especially if it concerns consumer-facing markets.
Makes sense, absolutely. The next question is related to the latest turbulences, how we can call them, geoeconomic, etc. do you sense, while being in contact continuously with the key, let's say, European establishment, how do you understand, how do you perceive that, is the Commission changing its approach to enforcing the DMA, which is primarily against gatekeepers from the United States? Bearing in mind, of course, that potential newcomers and most of the beneficiaries in terms of business users are also from the United States. So this accusation of protectionism is very, very,
doesn't make sense.
unfounded. But do you sense some kind of empirical changes in it? So do we have to be more careful now, or it's just high tier rhetorics without any implications on the ground?
No, I would not necessarily agree on that assumption. Look, Trump is transactional. The U.S. administration is going to be a transactional administration. So they basically, they don't care. They can call, because companies like some gatekeepers, are labeling these fines as tariffs. I'm sorry, they are not tariffs. It's simply the expression of our rule of law. A company has infringed the legislation, and there are consequences. The fact that this is being labeled, so to say, as a part of a trade war is something that I believe is not affecting the Commission. If you would ask me the same question maybe a few months ago, I would be like, I'm more careful. Yeah, I don't know. I really hope that they are not going to influence, so on and so forth. But I think the acts of the Commission speak by themselves. The fact that they have taken this decision now, that shows something. And there is another element we cannot forget, which is our courts. Our courts do not care and should not care about these geopolitical considerations. Our laws, our courts care about the rule of law and the application of our European national legislation. So if the Commission will not have taken this decision, nothing prevents a party like us, for example, or another organization to go to a national court. So it's actually in the interest of the Commission to have a decision in these particular cases. Otherwise, nothing prevents a national court to take a decision, which could lead to either more fragmentation across the member states on implementation and enforcement of the DMA. How things are going to evolve with the U.S. administration, we never know. The reality, and for me, the source of concerns is not because of the external pressure, but it's more from the internal pressure from certain sectors. For example, let's take airlines and telecoms, because these companies, the incumbents companies, had been using not only the international context, but also the domestic context in order to push for further consolidation in these markets. Despite the fact that all the evidence shows that competition in this market has been essential, not only for consumer well-being and welfare, but also to attract higher investments and roll out faster infrastructure. But the current context fits them perfectly well, because Europe is losing competitiveness, and we can talk about that in a moment, which is a reality. Maybe we disagree with some sectors about the root causes of this, and the situation with the US and China. So for them, they say, look, we have kind of the perfect storm to push for further consolidation, and now is the moment to do it. And that's why they're putting so much pressure on the European Commission to go more lax on merger enforcement. And we will have also the review of the horizontal guidelines. But something that they cannot ignore is not only the law, but also the precedents that we have in the court. So once we need to see how merger policy evolve, but at least from our side, we're going to be extremely vigilant, because we would not like to jeopardize the progress that have been made across all these industries that have very high entry barriers, in order to ensure that consumers can benefit from good prices, but also quality services.
Okay, so let us continue on this track and look at the industrial policy. How would you understand? What would be your? There is no end goal, but how would you visualize the main steps which the European Union has to undertake in the area of digital markets, where we understand the scale is probably unavoidable criterion requirement to succeed in delivering something of comparable quality to the current incumbents, and looking into competition from other jurisdictions which are quite, some of them at least are much more aggressive, much more consolidated. They have much wider apparatus. Some tools are not even accessible for democratic societies, so to say, but it works miraculously, etc. So what should be the strategic response? Just inject another portion of money into startups and expecting the best of them will scale up eventually, or it should be more consolidated? How do you see it?
Yeah, certainly no more consolidation. That's clear. But I think one needs to, take a step back and see why we are in this situation, and what are the questions that need to be asked. Very often we have confronted, to the question is why we cannot have an European Google. I'm sorry, we are not going to be able to challenge, the dominance of Google search. They are here to stay. The question is, what is going to be the next technology? If it's generative AI, how we can prevent that we have diversity in that market? And if it's come from European developers, even better. But on tech, Europe can also lead on so many different fronts. If you think about the health sector or in the finance sector, there are actually companies doing great products, and we should be focusing in supporting all these efforts. And when I say supporting all this effort, I don't mean just facilitating consolidation, just looking at competition policy. Competition policy can play a role, but it's not going to solve everything. In Europe, we have some fundamental problems in the way, for example, our capital markets are structured. In Europe, we don't have a capital markets union because of member states' protectionism. Just to keep the story a bit short. So, if a company needs to get capital, so you want to go to equity markets, Europe is not the best place. They can go somewhere else and they get listed, in the US or in the UK, or they try to find, venture capitalists, somewhere else. But the question is why? Because we are not short of money. Europe doesn't have a problem of liquidity. We have a lot of money sitting in saving accounts. The problem is that we are failing in moving this money, from saving accounts, to capital markets and equity markets, in order to invest and support the European economy, including, startups and innovation in the tech sector. So, well, we should not be fixated only on what competition policy can do, but it's a much broader, more picture. Then is the question, for example, of state aid. Should we make state aid easier? Then it will run into the never-ending situation that not all member states have the same capability to support the private sector. So is state aid the solution? I doubt. Can provide some flexibilities? Yes. Why not? But I think what is most important is trying to facilitate private investments in this sector. But for that, we need to overcome our own barriers, and barriers that we put ourselves through national protectionisms. And there is where, I think that when we talk about Europe's competitiveness, we need to start, with the basics. It's not about our legislation. No, it's not about, bureaucracy. And if there is bureaucracy, believe me, it's introduced at national level. It doesn't come so much from at the European level, because ultimately all these rules are implemented at national level, and there is where they come up with all different requirements, so it makes it very difficult, to provide services across borders, so on and so forth. So I think that we need to be also much more self-reflective about the barriers that we are imposing to ourselves that prevent this scalability.
The nature of European Union is a real miracle. How so many nations/civilizations, having 1,000 years rich history, economic, social, cultural history, have managed to integrate so quickly and so systemically is miraculous, of course. But yet it's still work in progress, and it continues work in progress. And from what you have suggested, identified as the key milestones, it doesn't look that it's achievable within the next years, let's say. It's a long process. So historically, it's not something unachievable, but you cannot achieve it within very quick
No,
somehow,
it's
because it's a long so does it really, should I infer from this that um, having a genuine union of capital and taxation maybe and some other somehow taming the interests of member state, most powerful member states, will not be done within the next decade, and thus the competitiveness in such sectors as digital is also very unlikely to be achieved in the following years?
I don't know. I think it can go fast. Just think, you just need a crisis for these people to wake up. We have never thought about joint procurement of vaccines until COVID. No? Even on food safety, food safety was not done until we had the mad cow disease, scandals in the several decades ago. So, or the financial crisis, banking supervision. We got banking supervision because of the financial crisis. So certainly, Europe maps can be slow, but when it needs to move, it moves quickly. And I think now we have an opportunity. Let's face it. The situation in the U.S. is terrible, especially for the people living in the U.S. When you see, your institutions being dismantled, but that offers an opportunity to Europe. But we need to get our act together. And at the end of the day, being investors, companies, startups, they want a stable place. And a stable place is also given by stable institutions, not only about reducing red tape or whatever you want to call it. It's about having stable institutions. And Europe can offer that. Of course, there are things that we need to improve, but we don't need to be apologetic about the rules that we have. Because these rules, they are not only to protect consumers, they are there to create a level playing field for companies. Because in absence of these rules, then you will have the incumbents or the bigger companies, including the big tech companies, that they will be able to capture even much more consumer surplus and market if it will not be because of the rules that we currently have. That they can be improved, that they can change, that they should evolve, absolutely. But we should not be apologetic about our rule-based system.
We have looked at the West. Let us have maybe a quick also look at the East. Should we learn maybe something from rapidly evolving jurisdictions, different rapidly evolving jurisdictions to Europe's East? And if yes, should we somehow process detoxify some of the practices? Who should be doing this? Is it something which should be undertaken systemically? Does BEUC look at these issues?
We do very much, especially at our membership, because we want to have organizations from the East, if I can call it, especially from accession countries, because the earlier you start, the better. And clearly, there is future in Europe for all these countries. The more we are sharing common values, common objectives, the better. Not only for the peoples of Europe, but also for the world. And in that regard, we invest in the consumer movement in Central Eastern Europe and in candidate countries, and we like to see that more. Of course, there are geopolitical situations that are extremely complex at the moment, and a lot of things have changed, with the new U.S. Administration. But something that I say that we can be proud of is of the system that we have in Europe that have provided the best conditions for, we can call it consumers, you can call it citizens, in terms of safety and protection around the world. And this is a project that deserves to be shared with others. So obviously, looking at the East is extremely important for the future of Europe.
And also looking further to the east, but that was somehow a dilemmatic issue, because you can achieve this global competitiveness in digital markets using liberal democratic toolkits, but also having much more centralized authoritarian approach to things,
Yes.
or different versions, variations of thereof. Should we have this kind of resistance towards the temptation to do it in a less democratic way, so to say, or maybe some practices are transposable to the European context, which are practiced, let's say in China or in India, or maybe in some other jurisdictions?
Look, the world is showing that those countries that don't have solid institutions become extremely volatile on the basis of the different transfers of power. The European Union has been criticized for being too bureaucratic, but I think it's that same bureaucracy that protects us from that, because we have check and balances. We have a judicial system, that works. We have a representation system that, with all its faults, still works and creates stability. So I don't think it's about comparing or about importing practices. It's about developing what works for us best. And in that regard, obviously decisions takes time, but we also have procedures to take decisions faster where needed, and where there is a political will to do so. And you mentioned at the beginning, Europe is complex. It's extremely complex. We have centuries of extremely complex history, that is still embedded in our legal traditions, and in the way we work and the member states interact, and so on and so forth. So obviously things are likely to take time, but this is, look, the basis of a democratic and plural society.
Okay, let us move from industrial policy back to the DMA. I wanted to ask you, Agustin, it's too early. We hear criticism of the Commission from pretty much day one. Everybody projects on the DMA their own expectations, interests, dreams, and it becomes kind of a hodgepodge of different types of criticism. Some are sincere, some are instrumental, opportunistic, etc. Astroturfing. But if you look without evaluating, just looking at the DMA, the first 2 years of its real life kind of existence, do you see that some core platform services became more open, leaving aside fairness, speaking more of contestability, so to say? Do you see that competition has been somehow triggered with
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And there is a lot of hope. It's still 1 year, so it's not such a long period of time, and 1 year where we have a lot of non-compliance. But we have seen some positive changes and some shifts in the market. And even if, let's say, Google will lose 1% of their market share in general search, that's 1%. In other smaller players, that's a lot. You can actually double or triple your customer base. So there are some changes, and that's what gives us hope that this law can work if it's effectively implemented and if necessary, obviously enforced.
But do you think, speaking of this metaphorical 1%, is it something which has to be or which could be potentially explored in terms of designing remedies, where instead of imposing financial fines, or instead of, or maybe in addition to imposing structural remedies, this could be a benchmark of somehow asking the gatekeepers in the form of somehow quasi commitments to abandon with choice screen, for example, to decrease their market share from 99% to 97%, and at least giving some crumbles to those potential hypothetical micro newcomers in the market, or it's something too esoteric?
The crumbles. Look, one also needs to look at what the DMA provides for. In our behavioral testing on choice screen, one of the conclusions was that demoting Google will have been beneficial in order to increase the rate of rival search engines that are chosen. But of course, then we have this conversation: can this be done in the context of the DMA? And there were diverse interpretation of what is possible or not. That's what I say at the beginning, is that changing fundamentally the market dynamics in this particular core platform services would be extremely difficult. We need to be realistic, but it can help. And it can help, from our perspective, to give more choices to people. Because without a choice screen, you are not even aware that those services exist. So even if brand recognition is still very powerful, because we saw it out in our testing, you still will have the possibility of having users that can identify other rival services. And that is where it can help to start opening markets. And it's a big lesson also for future markets as well, because this is not only about the service that we have today, but also the service that we have tomorrow, and what we can learn in order to prevent, we can call it mistakes or certain practices or actions that have been taken 10 years ago, which ultimately led to cementing the market power of these companies. So I think we can learn a lot for the future as well.
And do you think the gatekeepers, speaking with gatekeepers, do you think they are somehow prepared to go into supposedly less confrontation or less how to say, adversarial model, where they would be able to behaviorally sacrifice something in return to kind of relative peace for some period of time?
But look, I think all these actions and these proceedings have had a certain disciplinary effect. If you look at cases that were initiated against certain companies, let's say, 2 decades ago, those companies today have a much more cooperative, so to say, approach compared to those that have been just confronted to new investigations, that they are fighting much more to avoid any impact in the way they operate. So enforcement has a disciplinary effect. Now, will this change dramatically the landscape? No, there I have my doubts, but one will have to wait and see. For us, what is much more important, obviously, than fines is actual changes in the market, and companies, and especially the gatekeepers, have been resisting that a lot, and they will try to make changes so they are perceived as being compliant, but ultimately they don't need to modify significantly the way that they are operating or the practices. At the end of the day, they're also profit maximization entities. So we all need to acknowledge that fact as well. But as I said, we are seeing some positive changes in relation to some of the gatekeepers as a result of the actions taken by the Commission or the pressure by stakeholders like us.
One of the last questions. If you look at the evolution of digital markets and shaping competition and fairness, contestability and fairness in digital markets, how do you allocate? What is the role for the private enforcement, and in particular consumer kind of collective opt-out litigation, where the focus is on compensating long-term damages? Is it something which invigorates the overall regulatory framework, or is it is somehow in zero-sum relationship with public enforcement, where the more private enforcement you exercise, the less leverage the Commission still have? How do you see it?
That's a very good question. A little bit of history on this point. So originally, the DMA was not part of, or was not added in the annex of what we call the Representative Actions Directive. This is what we will enable organizations like BEUC, to go to a national court and seek enforcement of the DMA, either under injunctive relief or compensation. But we made a case showing that private enforcement can play a role. We cannot forget that the enforcement of the DMA is in the hands of the European Commission. They have exclusive competence with cooperation of the different agencies, and the NCAs are doing some NCAs are doing a fantastic job also to raise awareness about the DMA, contributing in cases carried out by the European Commission, so forth. But ultimately, the drafting pen is in the hands of the Commission. So we are basically, and the legislator have decided to put all the eggs in one basket. But we cannot forget our judicial system. So national courts are entitled to enforce and to apply European legislation. And that was very important to have the DMA including the Annex of Representative Actions Directive, because it creates an additional tool that is used on one side to seek enforcement and redress, access to justice, but on the other side also to show to the European Commission, like, look, do your job. If not, we go to a national court. And that is not obviously in the interest of the Commission, because a judgment will have effect only in the country, in the member state in which it is given. So that can also help to discipline, if I can put it that way. Maybe the colleagues in the Commission won't be very happy, but also to discipline the public enforcers. Because ultimately, here we all have an interest that the DMA is applied in the first place and enforced appropriately. And that includes also via the court. So I believe that we need to work in tandem with private and public enforcement. Also, once you have a public enforcement decision, well, nothing prevents you to have a follow-on action at national level. In this case, we cannot use the damages directive, but you use the representative actions directive for this. So we cannot forget that while we have the public enforcement on one side, we also have the question of restitution or redress if there is a harm that has been caused on end users or on business users, obviously.
Great. This is really informative and very helpful conversation. I really learned a lot of your views, and most of them resonate harmoniously with my understanding of things. I wanted to finish this conversation by inviting you to maybe provide some amicable suggestions, recommendations for students, because they are about to enter, they are newcomers in this game. So maybe what type of mistakes should be avoided? What are the main features which are still missing in this microcosm, and they can practice while doing their degrees?
I think learning from the past, that's fundamental. Now, looking at the history, why we ended up here, not only in terms of how markets have evolved, but also the legislation and the case law. And it's fascinating because we would not have had the DMA if it wouldn't have been because of all the work done by DG Comp and the national authorities on the competition law enforcement front. And there's a lot of things that we learn through those processes in order to have an instrument which is much more agile and faster to implement and to enforce, compared to competition law, which requires a much heavier machinery. So certainly, looking at where we come from, and then projecting where do we want to go. Which is the type of markets that we would like to see thriving in Europe and beyond Europe, and then questioning whether we have the right tools to do that job.
Excellent. Agustín Reyna, thank you very much indeed for this fascinating conversation.
Thank you to you, Alice, for the invitation, and always a pleasure.